Monotype.
Welcome to Creative Characters from Monotype, the show where we meet the people working at the intersection of type and everyday life. I'm your host, Dan Radigan, and today I'm speaking with Matt Holmes. Matt is a letterpress printmaker, PhD researcher, and self-described serial tinkerer based in the UK. I met Matt a few years ago at the Hamilton Museum Waste Goose, and he had such an infectious enthusiasm talking about the projects he was working on. I had to meet him, I had to talk more, and sure enough, I got sucked into the world of his crazy projects and what he was doing with them. So it was a delight to get to run into him a few years later at Typography Italiana, and we became better friends and led to all the things I wanted to ask that we'll talk about today. My co-host Cadley is here to preview this episode with me. Hi, Cadley.
Hi, Dan. Well, what stands out to you about Matt and his practice? I know that he doesn't really think of himself as a typographer or a designer, but he engages with type and design all the time.
You'll hear me tease him about that a little bit in this, because Matt never thought of himself as a typographer, as a designer, because he didn't go through kind of like a typical background education in the arts or design. But actually, I think he is a typographer, like engaging with it in the most elemental way. And that's a real true typographic experiment in process, watching him like figure out, how do you make letter forms? How do you make printing equipment? How do you make things from making type?
That's super cool. So you've said that Matt is a serial tinkerer. What does that look like?
He really does have this very boundless curiosity, and you see him light up like a kid on Christmas morning when he sees an old machine or some piece of printing or typecasting equipment that he doesn't quite understand, and he just wants to like pull it apart and get to understand it. He really does carry a little pair of calipers around with him so he can take precise measurements and try to figure out how all the pieces go together. It's great fun to watch.
Yeah, that's some real curiosity. Well, thanks so much for hosting this one. I will turn it over to you and Matt.
Hi, and we are here today with my pal Matt Holmes, who I like to think of as my mad tinkerer friend. But to be fair to Matt and the work he's actually doing, Matt is a PhD researcher at the University of Plymouth in the UK. And his current research work involves applying modern processes within the craft of letterpress printing. That's my capsule description taken from various bios of you, but how would you describe yourself?
I think you hit the nail on the head right there with just like serial tinkerer. I like to dabble in lots of different processes and lots of different making schemes, and generally just make a nuisance of myself in as many workshops, making and doing as much as I can. So I like the word tinkerer there.
I mean, I wanted to talk to you because I really do think of you as an honest to goodness creative character, to keep in theme with the podcast. And to give a little background, I met Matt a few years ago at an event at the Hamilton Wood Type and Printing Museum in Wisconsin. And he brought me into his orbit immediately by giving a little talk saying that he was basically trying to make a 3D printed and laser cut Vandercook printing press out of wood and plastic. And I know it's a lot more complex than that, Matt. Could you tell us a little bit about that project, and we can sort of expand from there?
Yeah, absolutely. So the project that I presented at Hamilton, where I was invited over by the Partners in Print to chat with, was my undergraduate and my master's research work that I'd been doing at the university at that time. So I'd been kind of skirting my way around the letterpress print workshop for ages. I've been studying 3D design, doing like furniture building, and I'd always seen the letterpress workshop through the window, and I just knew that I had to be in there somehow. And I was thinking to myself, like, well, if I don't have the press, why on earth can't I just build one for myself? I'd seen this glorious Vandercook press that I'd been able to use a couple of times. So, well, I need one of those, but I don't happen to have the ability to move 2 tons of press or have that amount of kind of steel sitting around in my bedroom at the time. So I thought, okay, do you know what? I'm going to build one myself. I started with my undergraduate building a tiny desktop version of the Vandercook cylinder press. Again, it was all out of plywood and it was all out of 3D printed plastic. And then I revisited it again for my master's and scaled up to the full size object.
Now, I think an initiative like that takes a whole lot of creative energy and a spirit to tackle the many, many problems involved in that. I think what I get a kick out about you is that for a while, at least, you wouldn't have thought of yourself as a creative person. I remember speaking to you about coming to join us at the Tipo Italia workshop in Italy at the Tipoteca Italiana Museum that I work at. And you were nervous because you didn't think of yourself as a designer or a typographer. And I had to remind you that you were like showing off the coolest like printing experiments and experiments with letter forms and the printed media and paper like all the time. Whether you're willing to admit it or not, you were really embodying this very creative experimental spirit. Do you feel like you've realized that yet?
I think it's taking some getting used to, and certainly I'm starting to try and at least acknowledge the fact that I am working and moving in these circles and playing with typography. I'm playing with making and getting stuff on paper. But I think what's interesting, particularly about the area that I found myself in with letterpress and printing and typography, is that because I've kind of come at it sideways. I have no training in typography. I have no training necessarily in printmaking. And because I'm sitting in this hybrid little space that sits somewhere between manufacturing with a CNC machine, playing with a 3D printer, and examining letter forms and seeing how those sit and how they work together, I'm never in any one of those little circles. I seem to sit between them all. So there's a perpetual little identity crisis sitting in there somehow, like, well, am I working truly in typography? Am I working in letterpress? Am I a printmaker? Am I not a printmaker? So it takes a little bit of wrangling, and it very much depends on the afternoon.
You're really practicing right in the heart of what printing and typography really was. It was a very integrated set of practices for hundreds of years. It's maybe only in the last century that all of those things became separate jobs where you would train just as a typographer or just as a printer or just a machinist, which is what I find so interesting about the research that you're doing and all the experiment you're doing is that it's like you're rebuilding like the full traditional practice of printing from first principles.
Yeah, it's true. It's been a very interesting learning curve, shall we say, to kind of pick all of that stuff up. And when I'm trying to mash this modern contemporary tooling into a heritage craft, I'm having to, as you say, go straight back to those principles and figure things out. But not only in the fact of just trying to research and understand what it is, but I need to then make those two things play well together. So just take, for instance, I'm trying to build my own type. So you think, okay, well, I'm going to work with type high. Okay, what is type high then? Are we talking American type high? Are we talking Italian type high? And I didn't realize that there was a good period for a couple of 100 years where people were having a bun fight over what an inch actually was. So then, good Lord, help me trying to understand what a pica then becomes and then converting it into metric. All of these things going around and trying to get them to work with my tools that are working in millimeters, not in picas and M's and N's. To be able to do all of those translations takes quite a lot of legwork to try and at least understand what on earth is going on and then, rebuild it up from there.
Well, and you're fabricating replacement parts for existing presses and pieces of machinery from time to time, aren't you?
Yeah, so it's not just working with building new stuff. I've been looking at how they can embed themselves into older practices as well. So I've got some good friends that are up in Princetown in Dartmoor in the UK, and they have this beautiful Soldan press, which they reckon is a one-of-a-kind experimental press that was testing out for newspaper printing. And they have got bits missing off it. Bits were broken. Some of the feed fingers for bringing in the paper were missing completely or broken off. So I said, well, why don't I pop up with my 3D printer and see what I can do. So we spent a couple of afternoons with me sitting there with my laptop, redesigning the parts and fitting the pieces onto their press to get that working again. It's fun being able to take these tools and move them across all of these practices where it's not just about making the new, but actually can it help to preserve and can it work with the old as well?
That gets you right into the heart of what you were talking about in terms of standardization. You are trying to apply current measurements and standards and how you may need to specify all this stuff for current machinery, but you still have to get it all to fit into machines that were not built to modern metrical standards. You must be pretty handy with a pair of calipers at this point.
I've definitely learned to be. And my micrometers are not far from my pocket at any one time. And, You noticed when we were at the Tipo Italia visit last year, I have a pair of calipers always around me, and I was just diving underneath presses, taking measurements here, there, and everywhere. So it's like anything I see, I spot. I'll try and take some data and some measurements, and I can then put it in my little kind of catalog to replicate later on.
Well, I think that it's what's valuable about the research that you're doing is since it's not all about the new. As a history nut, I really appreciate that you are finding ways to give new life to what otherwise might be just discarded machinery, discarded bits of type, otherwise discarded pieces of history. How much have you learned to appreciate that sort of history that preceded you by doing this?
The history that preceded this was always a really fundamental part of the practice that I've built up over the couple of years. So the very first project that I ever did in letterpress was to look at it through the lens of repair instead of like replace. So I was working with a guest tutor named Bridget. She came down to the university and she ran this module on repairability. And that was how I managed to get my in into the letterpress workshop. So I was looking at repair and talking about typefaces that were damaged, that these lead pieces were not replaceable. They were probably one of a kind that was sitting in that workshop. So I was looking at non-invasive repair techniques for working with these broken characters. I've got this beautiful letter M. It's a Helvetica M that's got a dink taken out of it where a gripper came round on the cylinder press and took a massive chunk out of it. And it's a beautiful object. And I was really taken by the fact that you could see the history of that object in there. Okay, you've destroyed it and it had written that piece off of ever being that clean, beautiful Helvetica M again, but it told a story, and like how many kind of stories were sitting inside those type pieces. So I was really keen to make sure that I wasn't overwriting anything in history, and what I was trying desperately to do was to actually kind of find that middle ground and that hybrid between the two. So it looks forward into the future of what we can do with these tools to, like you say, put things back together again. We can extend and we can evolve, but it also fundamentally looks back at the processes that were there and works in sympathy with them. And I think the poster that I printed at the end of that module was a Peaches quote, which is "Every little defect gets respect." And that's kind of been my little mantra to work with.
I love it. I think that's what draws people to letterpress printing these days. It is a little bit worn. It is very warm, and that you do have to embrace the history that came before you and work with material that has got a little ding or two alongside of it. Did you have any kind of background with letterpress printing or presses at all before you first saw them at school?
No, I had no background with letterpress printing at all before I came to university and I saw them in that workshop. I've always been drawn to mechanical things, shall we say. So my family is a family of car restorers, and we're not averse to ripping apart mechanical things, finding how they work, repairing them and putting them back together again. And there was something I found really gloriously mechanical about the letterpress process, regardless of the print that came out the other end of it, but the very kind of satisfying assembly of the type and then the clunk and the whir of the presses that was like pulling the prints and the rolling out of the ink. There was a lot of satisfying moments in that print workshop that really appealed to me and drew me in. And yeah, they couldn't get me out after that point.
So were you one of those little kids who was a danger to have around with a screwdriver and a hammer?
Oh, absolutely, yeah. I was definitely a Lego and Meccano kid, and there were things found disassembled that I probably shouldn't have disassembled around the house. But yeah, it worked out in the end, I think.
What I enjoy in seeing of some of the outputs of what you're doing printing-wise is that you're also exploring what the textures are of the 3D materials that you're making with. Again, you're not looking for the technology to make something that's a seamless illusion, but it looks like you're exploring what is actually the fabric of these new materials and how does that sit in sympathy, as you say, with the older materials.
Yeah, absolutely. Because I can throw these machines at it and I could spend hours and hours trying to get the perfect print off of a piece of type that you would be indistinguishable from a freshly cast piece of lead type or wood type or something like that. But what I found particularly interesting, and it was actually just little happy accidents, was letting the machines have their own language in the printed matter that came out from it. So the way the 3D printer works by laying down those lines of plastic has a very particular almost fingerprint that is left behind in the actual printed item. I have to be very careful when I start talking about print because I'm talking print 3D, print 2D, and I've got no idea what I'm talking about in between them. But by letting and not hiding those marks, the machine marks that were in the typepieces that I've been making, I've been able to kind of explore this little language that they are developing of their own. And I ran a little test print set of some letter A's a little while ago. And I was working with my friend Tim, and he had the idea to take terrain data, and apparently it's a trick that they use in some graphic design worlds, was to take terrain data and get the contour maps so you get these organic flowing lines. So we nicked a bit of the data from the Alps, and I cut a letter A out of the Alps, and then used that and broke that down into slices to create a print from it. And I had these lovely wavy lines built inside of the sharp, I think it was an Arial A that I'd chosen for it, nice and original. But what happened then was when I ran that through the 3D printer, the 3D printer built a scaffolding around the areas that I'd carved away using that terrain data. And I'd got this kind of combination between the harsh straight lines that I had intended to be there in my print, and then these weird flowing fingerprints that the 3D printer had put in of an algorithm of its own deciding to put them in that place. And they were working together in this really interesting little language that I had never even expected to find. Suddenly I'd stumbled on this entire different language that the machine was trying to show through the print.
And voila, that's what creativity actually comes down to, is that exploration and celebration of the results.
I'm learning to lean into those happy little accidents.
And in terms of the type making itself, I mean, I think as less of a precision machinist, it's easier for me to believe that you can fabricate replacement parts that do the job. But I remember being sort of very skeptical when I first came across the idea of 3D printing type, that you could make type with the same precision that we might get out of other processes. How have you been grappling with that kind of precision that typographers these days demand with what you're able to fabricate?
I think it kind of sits in between that area of letting the machine do what the machine is good at, and having to balance that with what we kind of want as an output for it. So the first kind of type pieces I was making, the type height was wrong. I could not for the life of me get the point sizes right. So trying to translate. So I was working with another friend of mine. We were developing a piece of software that will build 3D printable type sorts from like OTF file formats, trying to decipher what all of the leading and the kerning and things were going to then put and position the type piece onto the type, the character onto the type piece, has been a very steep learning curve and has absolutely not given the results that I'd intended to. So there's always a bit of tension in there between what I know it should look like and what I can actually get out of the machine. But I think what's been fun is that I'm working with all of these pieces of technology, and actually I've been using 3D printers for a few years now, and I'm seeing that the machine quality is improving and the outputs are getting better and better, and that's letting me dial in those type pieces to a closer and closer approximation to what it should be, or what I say it should be. But that's just my opinion of what it should be versus what somebody else's opinion of what it should be.
Well, and to be fair, the historical processes for type making involved multiple steps to get that kind of precision. We're a little bit spoiled these days where you can take a scalable form of a font, like an OTF or TTF open type font, and blow it up and see incredibly smooth lines and curves. But really, if you look at how a pantograph would cut wood type from a pattern, there's often a process of using files and graving tools to cut out the small acute details and to get those sharp bits right. And even in the factories at Monotype and Linotype, where they were making this precision machinery for casting type, there were quite a few manual steps to get closer and closer from what the machine could do on initial pass to the final element. So it sounds like once again, you are sort of rediscovering from first principles what the craft of arriving at a typeface was really like.
I was working on some typepieces last week, and I realized that in that moment I'd seen what I was doing before. So I'd been printing these pieces and there were some little bits that were stuck to the side. So I was sat filing down the bases of all of these type sorts. I was like, I've seen this picture somewhere before. And then lo and behold, it was somewhere on Instagram. I was watching somebody casting lead to type and they were filing down the bases of the type pieces. It's like, I'm doing the same thing. The material's slightly different, but actually the motions that I'm going through are identical potentially to those traditional practices. And I think that's absolutely brilliant, because even though the machines that I'm using aren't the same machines, realistically, I'm doing the same processes and learning potentially the same skills. And that's a real key thing for me in this work, is that I'm not trying to lose those skills. I'm trying to rediscover what they might be, but also then it brings in a little bit of preservation of those skills, because what I quite like the idea of is that if I'm making these type pieces with my 3D printer and having to learn how to file them to size, if I then approached metal type, then potentially it's not going to feel all that alien to be doing the same motions just with that lead metal instead.
I love thinking about you working with technology and coming to these realizations, because so much of the discourse about technology is about making things faster and more efficient and move at ever greater velocity. But you're really taking advantage of technology in a way that honors the value of going slowly and rediscovering things. Have you found that innate tension working with technology the way that you are?
I don't think it really builds in a tension because of the way that I approach the projects. Mm-hmm. Because I was approaching working with letterpress printing and using this technology, particularly to maintain the knowledge of how these processes worked, I absolutely could print all of the letters into one type plate, and I could print it exactly as if it had been something like photo typeset or something along those lines. But because I was deliberately choosing to manufacture each individual type sort one by one, to then mean that I had to set every single type piece by hand. And I made choices all the way along, such as like I rebuilt the coins for completing the lockup of the type pieces into the chase. I chose not to redesign it in a way that could have been more efficient for the 3D printer to make because of that technology process. I still wanted to have a coin key to be able to go around my letterpress lockup and lock it up the same way that it would have been done for 100 years or so. So because I've always been using technology deliberately to go slow, it's been kind of a bedrock of why I do it that way. So I like the fact that I'm designing it, that I have to do it by hand. It never actually removes me from the process, which I love.
And how are you thinking about how your research can be shared? I mean, are you expecting that other people would fabricate things in a similar manner based on what you're doing? Or are you setting people up to say, use your research to take it in other directions?
It's a bit of both, really. And I think what has been interesting sitting in this little hybrid space between a maker and a printer is realizing that I'm talking to two different groups of people here and learning the technologies on both sides of those processes. So the question I get asked is, okay, well, I'm a printer. Do I need to learn how to use a 3D printer then? Or I'm a maker. Do I really want to learn about print? So actually being able to learn how to translate between the two and trying to use my kind of position that sits in that hybrid space to help printers to understand what this technology is doing, and then maybe the people working with the technology to understand what the printers are doing with it, gives me a really kind of interesting middle ground to be able to help kind of disseminate that information in both directions. So some of my work is going to be about sharing those files for making those typepieces. I mean, I've been uploading some of my files online, so you can go and find the 3D printed coins that I've built. They're online for free, and you can download them. If you have a 3D printer, you can knock a whole bunch of those out yourself. But then actually, how do I share that information that will then inspire somebody else to go on and make their own versions of it? Because I'm absolutely not doing it the best way. I'm doing it my way of doing that. But I'm not necessarily a printmaker. So how does it inspire those that have a little bit of those kind of colliding knowledges as well to go, oh, well, I know a little bit more about that process potentially, so I can see something that needs tweaking in there, and then resharing that and sharing that process and continuing that evolution of those tools and equipment.
That's amazing. How are people responding to the work that you're doing? I mean, are there people who are kind of running with it yet?
It's got kind of two different sides to this, which has been quite fun. So I've had pictures of some of the pieces that I've been built sent to me from across the world, of people downloading them and then sending me images and comments back saying, these are great, these have worked fantastic in my print shop, thank you so much for sharing them. And then on the flip side, I have people saying, well, I've got an entire drawer of coins. Why on earth would I need these 3D printed tat? I had to sit there for a little while and go, well, I think you've totally missed the point here, because you have a whole drawer of these coins. I don't. So I'm going to have to make them. And there's been some tension, shall we say, between some of them. I worked with a friend of mine to develop a Photoshop plugin that simulated letterpress textures. Now, that is enough to make most printers shudder in horror at the idea of putting in these textures into Photoshop and taking away the printed kind of feel for it. And the way that we built that tool was from original wood type. So we had wood type blocks that had come from, I think it was the DeLittle factory, got 1960s original blocks of wood. And we were printing those, and we were getting the textures off of original blocks of type high timber and off the back of different type pieces. And we were scanning those in and using those to create those textures. And the idea being that, not everyone has access to these tools to print letterpress. But why do we have to put up with the ability to look at? There was a phrase that I'm not going to repeat in polite company, but it was about the food menu. And if you spot the double O in a food menu, and if somebody's applied a letterpress texture to it and you can see the same damage on the double O next to each other, that's something that my friend showed me and made my blood boil. And now I cannot unsee it. And that has ruined it for me for forever. And for anyone listening to this that also starts spotting that, my apologies, but there you go. So we were asking, why can't this be done better? And we were using this tech to be able to share that love for it. And I think that was the key thing, is we both were really loving letterpress. We were loving these textures and processes that were coming out, but why not put that into the advantage of being in these tools and technologies? So it came from a place of care about the process, but then most people were like, yeah, brilliant, kind of like it. And others were like, well, why on earth would I do this when I can just print it myself? And well, there we go again.
Yeah. You've certainly caught the love of letterpress printing and playing with type, using all this equipment. Have you started feeling like typography makes sense, since, again, you're grappling with the physical material in a way that has created the language that we use for typography these days?
I've certainly had to have a much greater appreciation for that. Because, working with letterpress, you understand that there is no such thing as negative space. It's all filled with something. It all has to be there in a physical form to be able to replicate that item on a printed page.
Yeah.
So I now have a very much better understanding of what all of these terms mean in my word processor and what I'm actually using them for. Being able to be hands-on with those tools. So when you're talking about leading, it's a physical lump of lead sitting in between those items.
Or a synthetic material doing the same job in the same physical space.
Yeah, it could be lead, it could be 3D printed plastic, it could be anything that I happen to have kicking around in my workshop generally tends to be wedged into my letterpress lockups. But the typography part of it has proved particularly interesting to start diving into, particularly as I've been starting to look at this type manufacturing. Like I say, trying to understand how to build the typepieces has meant having to go back to those first principles of how that type is designed, to understand how it is supposed to sit on the page in relation to its other characters. Very much describes how I need to make those typepieces to be able to fulfill that function. Mm-hmm. I think I've used this quote, and it's a quote from Doctor Who, which is, "A footprint doesn't look like a boot." And I love that because it kind of does speak about letterpress printing and the printed characters on page, because you may have your letter A, for instance, but that says nothing to what is going on holding that character up in physical space to be printed on the paper. Mm-hmm. Now, you don't know what's going on with the typepiece that is creating the counters, which is creating kind of the offsets. There's a lot of stuff going on in the background that you never see on the printed item that you have to be aware of if you're trying to rebuild the type in physicality.
The kerning is not just moving things a little bit closer or further apart, but when you are dealing with the underlying support structures, kerning is making decisions about adding material or subtracting physical material in a way that the surface can move in relation, but the underlying body still has to be sturdy and supported. It is a spatial problem. It is not a two-dimensional problem by any means.
It's a wonderful spatial problem, but what I like is that it's a spatial problem in 2D that then relates into 3D. And then it becomes a physical problem for me to be able to create and build these structures and create and build these typepieces, which then you probably will never see any of that effort on the printed page, but it's there.
One of the things that is an artifact of my learning graphic design before an age of ready access to digital 4-color printing is I think of designing with color as a sculptural process in a very, very flat plane. I just innately think about color in terms of separation and the sequence in which inks go down and where pieces have to sit on the page in order for the colors to go down and yet another pass. And there's an extension of that gets to doing all this with letterpress, which is again the physical spatial problem about when you take this flat sculptural plane and get it to, 978 thousandths of an inch into a plane and then begin to work out how the pieces go together. Again, it gets to the idea of slowing down can help you learn and understand in a way that opens up other possibilities. You say that how white space is not empty space when you're actually working with letterpress printing. It has to be anchored somehow. There has to be stuff there that makes you really consider, even with the two-dimensional design aspect of it, what is a space that has nothing in it? It is still a function within your overall composition.
What's quite fun about using digital fabrication tools within letterpress stuff is that, you've got these negative spaces that have got stuff in them. But what we can do now with these tools is that we can start to mess with those rules. So something like, we've got the grid system and everything is now in a nice, neat, orderly line because you're building it from rectangles and squares. What really is unlocked by using things like 3D printers and being able to design your own typepieces is that you can take those rules and you can totally throw them out the window and you can start to build your own interpretations of it. So I was building the little lockup magnets that if you want to do a quick lockup, you can use magnets to hold things together. Yeah. And I was thinking to myself, well, why isn't it an L shape? Because I'm trying to hold a corner in place, but all of the original letterpress magnets that I'd seen were all just straight bar magnets and you needed them in there. So I rebuilt them to be L shapes and you could add bits on and take bits off to change how that lockup was sitting.
Oh my God, of course.
So why would you not when you have the tool and the ability to make those flips and changes kind of on the fly? And especially if you've got something like a 3D printer sat in your print workshop, which I've got. I'm lucky to have one of these 3D printers sat next to my printing setup, and I can hit print and within an hour I've got new tools to change how my typesetting is laying down on the page, and I can iterate that really quite fast. And if, say, my typepiece isn't quite right, I can send another, and I can change and I can morph and I can adapt from there.
And are you finding, as you grapple with the physical realities of making this, are you leaning towards certain kinds of typeface choices that you're fabricating? Are you discovering that different designs lend themselves to the process better than others?
I've always been a fan of a sans serif. Like, it just works nicely with all of the kit, and I have been trying to learn to love a lovely serif font, but that presents its own particular difficulties, shall we say. So something like a nice swirling serif F may overhang the body of the letterpress typepiece. Again, you would never know that when you're working in just with the printed 2D artifact, but they have overhangs and they hang off into negative space. And actually, if you look at some original letterpress prints, those bits will be missing because they would have been overhanging on the original lead and have been knocked and broken off and lost to time. Trying to replicate that and trying to replicate those in a nice way on these 3D printers has proved a little bit of a challenge. So slightly resistant to those at the moment because they're giving me a bit of a headache, but I can't get away for a lovely chunky typeface.
Kerning is a generational dilemma. I remember at that same event when we met, I had been doing a type crit with a designer named Javier Veramontes, who's studying at Indiana University now. And he was working on a typeface that had ink traps, and he had been treating it as sort of a stylistic effect. And he and I were talking about how, it's actually a functional thing that came out of giving places for ink to go for smaller typefaces. And I think within the same day, you were asking me about this dilemma about typefaces that could handle sort of fine detail with, the fidelity that your 3D printing could do. And it was this great light bulb moment for me, and then Javier, and then for you, about some of these challenges that designers have grappled with for different reasons over the years, have this continuing relevance, like those cuts that you may find that sort of helped with the clarity of printing ink on rough newsprint paper by high-speed mechanical presses also turned out to be useful in photo typesetting for areas where, the camera would wear away fine detail if you weren't careful. And then also turned out to be easier to get some of those fine acute details with your 3D printer. And I think that's where I love seeing how abstracted design problem solving proves to be valuable again and again and again over the years. In asking about the kinds of typefaces that you are playing with, do you even find that there's a difference between old or new typefaces in terms of your ability to fabricate it now?
There are some subtle differences, and I think particularly you can tell the older typefaces in the way that they were constructed. They lend themselves to those manufacturing techniques in a certain way because the initial thought was, okay, I'm going to have this carved into a metal stamp and then I'm going to have this cast in lead. Now that we're working abstracted from that manufacturing process with typefaces, there's a whole lot of freedom that is opened up to that, but that if I'm trying to then reverse engineer those to turn them back into a physical artifact, that can throw up problems. It can throw up happy accidents as well, but it's a very different approach to how those typefaces are manufactured. And when you start from the idea of it has to be made, so therefore what you're designing for is something that has to be made versus something that is designed that then may only ever appear on a screen, there are two very subtle different ways of approaching that. And that does show up in some of the bits that I've been working with. So I think I actually asked you this question when we were in Italy last year. I was struggling with some typefaces because of the overlaps and the way that typefaces are being designed now on softwares, where you were saying that they can be designed in blocks and you can recycle the blocks because they are overlapping and you reuse pieces.
Yeah.
When you run that through and is displayed digitally, you'd never know that there were overlapping sections to it. But when I take that information out and I try and 3D print from it or manufacture from it, all of those little lines start showing back up again, and the computer can see them and starts doing really weird things with it.
Oh, of course.
And I was pulling my hair out trying to understand what on earth was going on. And then it was having conversations with you, I was realizing that it was because of the way that the typefaces had been designed, particularly for being displayed on a screen, that it had never been designed to be pulled apart for me to do something very strange with it. It was probably never in the type designer's mind that somebody was going to be bonkers enough to try and manufacture it into a physical typepiece.
See, that sounds like another area ripe for experimentation, though. How do you go further into that problem and then design for the weirdness that would happen? Maybe that's this summer's challenge.
That's this summer's challenge, yeah.
So we started getting you into the process of drawing type last summer at Typoteca. How did that work its way into your thinking about all of this practice? You had been making the pieces that would display a letter, but what have you started learning about designing type?
It was a very interesting practice for me to start drawing the typepieces myself. It goes a little bit back to when we were just saying, like, what is the identity of the work that I'm doing? Is it the print that I'm making, or is it the tool that gets there to make it? Like, am I building presses, or am I building typepieces, or am I making prints?
Insert why not both .gif.
Why not all of the above? So when I spent ages initially working with the typefaces that I was finding online and things, I wasn't necessarily looking so closely at the printed outcome. I was looking at, can I make the tool that will enable this to be printed? That's where my work and my processes have started to evolve and started to move into the kind of typographic space, because now I've sort of proving the point that the type can be manufactured. It's now into that space of, well, what can we do with it? How can it be moved around? So like working with these machine languages that are coming through in the print, by starting to move into that typographic space, and you'd say learning how to draw my own type, it's now starting to move into another little side rabbit hole of weirdness in designing typefaces. You'll make a typographer of me yet, I'm sure.
I'm certainly going to try. I mean, it's hard for me not to share my obsessions, and I can see that same sense of glee with your obsession. So you're clearly a good mark. I think that sense of discovery is what makes it fun to be around you when you see cool machines you haven't seen before. You light up like a kid in Santa's workshop, seeing everything like happening for the first time.
It was very funny last year when we were at the Tipo Italia warehouse. So Dan, you knew what was coming when you were going to reveal that door, and you were recording the moment that it happened, and just apparently the look on my face was something to behold, and my jaw hit the deck when I saw all of these wonderful type machines and type casting equipment. And I think there was a very real threat that I was going to disappear underneath all of the equipment and you wouldn't find me again for another 2 weeks.
But at the same time, I think half the delight is wondering, what would you have made by the time you emerged from that pile of old equipment? What plans would have been circulating in your head already?
There was a very real risk.
I mean, I've seen you take an old press and pull it apart and restore it. Are you finding ways yet to optimize some of the function of these older pieces of equipment that you deal with? Or are you still really trying to faithfully replicate the pieces just to understand how they worked? Have you gotten to the inventor stage yet?
I think the stage that I'm at is I'm still very much in that learning phase. So I'm taking these pieces and doing all of that reverse engineering of them. But I've got plenty to play with in that space because, like we said before, just because you have the piece itself and you can take the measurements from it, then designing it to be manufactured with new materials in new processes takes some thinking about itself, because although it might replicate it in shape and in form, the actual materiality behind it may not work the same way. So there's a bit of thinking that has to go on. It's not so much of a straightforward way of just going, okay, I'm going to replicate this piece. Every piece then has to be assessed as to whether or not it's going to work, and it's an appropriate thing to do with these processes that I'm applying it to.
Yeah.
So I've just been rebuilding, I think the one you're alluding to is a platen press that I had been given by somebody that said, basically, if you can get it out of the shed, you can have it for free.
Famous last words.
Yeah, very famous last words, as I learnt, and my poor long-suffering friend learnt when we had to get it out of the shed, down the garden path, avoid the 2 dogs that were trying to trip us up at the time, and move this like 700 kilos of cast iron into his van. Yeah, we made it, we got it out, and I've been rebuilding it. And I've been putting this back together, again, with the thought of like, how can the tech help me with this piece of 100-year-old equipment? So it's gone back together, but bits were broken, bits were missing. So I was remaking parts to fit to it. And I have a bit of a long scheme at some point, which is that it was mechanized at one time. It had a motor which would have spun up the platen. The idea of that fills me with absolute horror and fear of this whirling platen press. Like, I'm nowhere near skilled enough to be operating that at full chat right at the moment. But why can't there be something in there that a computer is helping me out with that? So I have plans and schemes to give my little platen press a brain, shall we say, and see what happens with that.
So this is all very practical work that we're discussing. You're tinkering and you're making. What kind of form is this taking in terms of the doctoral work that you're doing?
The way that the kind of the practical practice-based work sits alongside the doctoral research is very much embedded in that idea of what is the theory behind it? What is the meaning? What's the reason and the why? That's always the way that goes with this kind of research stuff. So what I'm digging into with the research half of that is to look at the space that is being built by this hybrid between the old and the new. I try and avoid saying things like old versus new, so like original versus replica, because what I've been trying to dig into in the research side of that is to talk about a new kind of way of exploring the hybrid space that sits in that area between them, which is not in opposition. So I'm digging into the research, particularly about what is that hybrid space that is not in opposition to the past, but actually trying to assist it, but evolve it. And then that leads me down some very glorious rabbit holes where you start actually saying, well, what is letterpress really? And if you start to pull apart some of these practices and go, what makes letterpress letterpress? Is it the movable type? Is it the fact that you can set it by hand? Is it the press that it is printed on? But then if you think, people then also will say that photopolymer sits under letterpress, but then photopolymer may be seen more as a relief process. So it starts to open all of these little kind of avenues for exploration of what truly is the practice that I'm working inside of, and then helping me to articulate what this new type of process is with the technology that I'm adding to it. How does that sit in that world? How does that really kind of meld between all of the different processes that have come before it and the definitions that are either existing or updating as we go?
Matt, I was telling people how I once teased you for saying that you weren't really a printer or typographer, but it's been so nice talking to you because I think you've made the case that I would have all along, that you are a typographer, you are a printer, but actually you're an awful lot more, which is what makes it interesting. And I'm really glad you came to have a chat today, and I look forward to many other mad science adventures with you in the future.
Oh, it's been lovely chatting to you as well. Thank you so much for inviting me on.
Check out Matt's work at holmesylogic.co.uk. That's HOLMESY logic.co.uk. Or follow him on Instagram at holmesylogic.
Thanks for listening. If you like our show, please subscribe, rate us, and share us with a friend. Creative Characters is brought to you by Monotype. It's produced by Christopher Olin and Mia Sullivan. We'll be back in a couple of weeks. Take care.